Welcome to Baruch Menashe's podcast. This is a space for rigorous exploration of human development, psychology, and social interactivity. Each episode examines the underlying structures of thought, behavior, and interaction, offering insights drawn from education, research, and philosophical reflection. Here we engage deeply with ideas, question assumptions, and illuminate the patterns that shape both individual growth and collective experience. Join me as we unpack complex concepts and translate them into understanding, perspective, and meaningful dialogue. We usually discuss the ability of multiple intersections between an individual's happenstance and the external reality. For example, intentionality or social interactivity, at which time the separatist of itself in concurrency with environment teaches its limitations. If it is one's personal social experience, then they will find that the limitation of that social experience, the environmental reality, one will acknowledge that there is something within that experience, that dynamic that is not internal. There's an external interference, and that will teach its limitation. And how one would be discussing an interaction to realize that there is an ulterior system that is allowing this dynamic to play out. And because of that, because one has a deep awareness of the trueness of that dynamic, they will allow that limit to set the criteria of what should and could be the possibility of that interaction. So much so that it would allow them true value of what social process is taking place, because they've adapted not to social process, but to the internality which juxtaposes social process in a manner where they realize the externality and avoid it for the purpose of the internal structure. The same can be said with intentionality, where the intention is meeting its manifesting limitation based on environmental contradiction. And if one is truly embedded in the intention and its applicating process, they will avoid continuing manifestation because there is an external system that is taking over, taking charge of the intention's purpose. However, all these cases, and there is a multitude of differentiating possibilities that would allow for internal process, irrespective of environmental sequence, will be previous to any representational effect. If one is already embedded in the environment, have become a part of that system, then there's no manner of approach that would allow for an alternative system. For example, if one is part of the environmental system, yet seeks to follow a personal interactivity, they are doing so based on a very real representation that took place in their psyche based on the environment. It doesn't even commence from the fact of personability. And even when they do reach a certain personal aspect, it is rather the distribution of what has been infrastructure rather than what is manifesting from their internality. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle because once the representation has taken effect, one is speaking, acting, and becoming in all their happenstance from the infrastructural and representational setting. They are not free to indulge in internalities of any kind, and in that way become disposed of any other system of affairs This is the costly effect of representation, or becoming embedded to the infrastructure, that now one has no ability of alternative systems. And the example of the youth, the adolescent becoming an adult, the moment they enter into a representational infrastructure, they cannot re-enter into a youth scenario. That is through internalities as a process, because they've become enmeshed with the infrastructure. In some sense, they've become acquainted with the very broader system that which all their internal processes has taken heed of. Once one has been regularly habituated to a representational theme, they are thus part of infrastructure in the social sequence. It is not as though the other particulars, the other approaches, are completely lost. It is rather that now one has the prerogative to understand and set a criteria as though they are external from them, but retain parameters of association that are necessary for broader schemes. If one is completely socialized, does not account for the other matters of approach that in some sense are not able ground for a regular social process, but in themselves are a developmental structure of internality, then they lose the memory of development, first and foremost, of themselves in gaining entrance to infrastructure for whatever the case scenario is. As short as that internality has occurred, it is the bedrock of one's associative personal realm, in which entertains the criteria of themselves in social process. When one loses the memory of such and the realization of socialization that relies on these eternal systems that lead up until it becomes a representation, then de facto they set society to continuously become representational, ignoring and neglecting the internalities that have been developed henceforth, more so in their personal realm, to neglect the coming of age process. They've endeavored to finally become an infrastructural object and interaction. It is not as though one is secluded from these preliminary stages of societal interaction. They merely are at the opposite side of its purview, such that if they go to the extreme of complete neglect, then they fail in the social sequence, becoming completely representational and devoid of internalities. What is really occurring is the notion of external sacredness between the source and its counterpoint, where as of youth or the preliminary internality that hasn't been represented, the shrine of its externality is the environmental reality that is beyond its criteria. And if it goes to its extreme of remaining internal, avoidant to any reality that is broader than what is occurring, then de facto it becomes too internal, too in depth of itself, and does not prove to be purposeful when it becomes available as an intersection, and is also avoidant to the wholeness of that personal realm, which is at the cusp of an externality that is beyond itself, which is realistic in all aspects. If one is deeply entrenched in the relatable activity between child and the parental body, it is always factual that the parental body is embedded in a broader environment, so that if the child ignores completely its reality of being beyond it, then they lose out on the internality itself, because each are reliant on the other. That is not to say that they must approach the environment which serves the parental body, because then they've reached the representational aspect and no longer are part of that internality, but only that they must rely on that duality between the two realms that would allow for internality to be its namesake. More so in the parental body, when it is actually represented in the environmental structure, it is also necessary not to completely become embedded in the infrastructural realm and thus lose the namesake of the dynamical inferences between a parental body and its offspring, as though it is somehow just a object of the universe rather than something internal for itself. Yet the parental body in itself acknowledges its embeddedness to what is beyond it, so that it's that realization of the sacredness of the childhood dynamical inferences that are internality, even though it is not internal in their subjective selves as parental bodies. It is thus respected at the cusp of the other side, which, if it gone to the extreme of respect, then it is an attempt of internality when already representative, which is merely an aggregated version of representation as though it is an internality, or at the other extreme of projecting all that is occurring in this internality as though it is simply representational without a concurrence of individualized material in the child's subjective self, which is also fundamentally untrue to the child's reality. They do not experience the environmental reality beyond the parental body, and thus there is a falsehood on either side of the occasion. Either falsehood in the subjective reality of the internality, or falsehood in the objective reality of the environmental dependency.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.